Hello everyone, warm welcome to everyone online and here in Prague. I welcome you to the second lecture on urban practices and social change, which is organized by Ethnology. I'm very excited that we have Alexa Färber here from the University of Vienna. She has accepted our invitation and will speak today about enduring the city, how to do social change with promises. Before I will give the floor to you and also introduce you in more depth, I will briefly introduce our center's research endeavor. So CESCAMI stands for the Center for the Study of Social Change and the Material Environment, in short, CESCAMI. The center is based here at the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. And we are a newly established team of researchers led by Slavomíra Berenčová, and the other further team members are Petra Jelička, Teresa Lokšová, who's also here, and myself, Anja Decker. We started working together thanks to the support from the Czech Academy of Sciences under the framework of the award Lumina Quadrature. The Center at CESCAMI focuses on cities as sites where innovation and knowledge and agency originate. Yet we approach innovations as new practices and knowledge that emerge from everyday life. We focus on innovative strategies of people concerning everyday tasks and their dealing with the material environment, including, for example, food production, consumption, housing, its renovations, adjustments, informal care for urban green spaces, and also waste reduction strategies. So we are particularly interested in how everyday strategies are constantly produced and reproduced in the face of challenges posed by global, social, economic, and environmental changes that impact on localities. At the same time, we study cities as sites where many expert-led solutions to pressing issues are being implemented. And in this aspect, we focus on researching the interaction between formal and informal innovations. Our predominant focus is on Central and Eastern Europe, while we try to develop a comparative perspective wherever possible. So this series of 3 lectures follows last year's conference on interactions between formality and informality in urban contexts, where we engaged with insights from the margins. The guest lectures of this year all focus on a broad range of topics such as sustainability, urban practices and politics, everydayness and informality, and all their potential for social change. Please be aware that we are a hybrid event. Part of the audience is online and a part is here with us in Prague. We will record this lecture, and in order to have it later available on our website, on the YouTube channel there. However, to enable a relaxed and intense debate, we have decided that the discussion will not be recorded. So please feel all free to post your questions later. And for those who are online, you know the procedure, raise your digital hand, or you can also write questions in the chat, which we will see during the whole time. So it is now with great pleasure to introduce Alexa Färber. Alexa is professor at the Department for European Ethnology at the University of Vienna in Austria. She has earned her PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And before accepting the professorship in Vienna, she has been, amongst others, on postdoc and later assistant professor at the Humboldt University and a full professor at the University of Architecture and Metropolitan Development in Hamburg. In her work, Alexa connects cultural analysis of the everyday with both the anthropology of knowledge and audiovisual ethnography. She has worked conceptually in interdisciplinary working contexts and has published, amongst others, on the concept of the takeability of the city, the concept of low-budget urbanity, and most recently on the city as a promissory assemblage. And Alexa thus invites us to study the connects of city and promise, to work with an anthropology of knowledge on diverse fields of contemporary societies, and to experiment with an audiovisual and multimodal research approaches. So thank you very much for joining us here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay, so just a second. Hello, everybody here in the, oops, I still see you. I still see your slides. Okay. Hello, everybody. Here in the room and in the digital space. Thank you, Anja and Teresa, for inviting me to the CESCMA, is that right? Center for the Study of Social Change here in Prague at the Czech Academy of Science. I'm very thankful for this invitation that allows me to get to know your research in the center and beyond this, and to start hopefully exchanging more regularly between Prague and Vienna, which is so close to each other, even more so if we have a shared interest in urban studies and social change. I have the feeling it's a wonderful team that Slavomira Verenčová has built up here with the possibility of creating the center. So I'm really curious to, after my talk, to start the discussion. It is, of course, difficult to speak about a subject that you and I have developed long before the war in Ukraine unfolds the way it does today. There's no way that what I will present today helps to understand this most terrifying situation that has deep impact on change all over the world. Death and displacement, destruction and contamination. And also long unquestioned political attitudes, for instance, neutrality for Austria, or hard-won political goals like climate protection or phasing out nuclear energy, or hard-won political have been called into question or suspended. The immediate existential threat on Ukrainians' lives and sovereignty allowed or pushed towards the rethinking of other long-term life-saving measures. So this is transformation that will entail social change, or does entail already. It is not what I'm going to talk about, although war too invites multiple utterances of promises on the one hand, and the destruction of even more promises that have given before. So although we cannot step out of this terrifying frame that has been imposed on us, I try to fit to my area of research, that is urban anthropology, and the city as promissory assemblage. Which sounds joyful, but it is not necessarily. A research perspective that I've been developing since a couple of years, that is to investigate the relation of promise and the city. So now I will turn to my share my slides with you. And I guess you see the row of slides on the side. I don't care, it's not so bad. I prefer than having all my screen shut down by one picture. So we are here. That is the title of my paper. Enduring the City, How to Do Social Change with Promises. Might be a commonplace that the attractiveness of cities stems between others from a multitude of promises that are associated to them. They include access to infrastructures, housing, health, education, mobility, to consumption, to diverse other social cultural opportunities, and a very strong economic promise to work. These urban promises typically appear as promises of urbanity, that is, of a certain quality of life in the city. Urban promises are therefore imbued with ethical imaginations of freedom, equality, and care. That is one side of the coin when we think about promises and the city. The other is the fact that promises most often are recalled or remembered when they are not fulfilled. And I'm almost sure that since I started talking about promises and your thoughts went in all directions, that you probably remembered more unfulfilled promises as fulfilled ones. That said, we could say promises work against better judgment. Major urban development projects, such as the Hafen City in Hamburg, where I've taught at the Hafen City University during 8 years, are a wonderful example of other urban development sites for how different promises intertwined are perhaps forgotten, overseen for a while, and are brought up again when a legislative period is over and the election campaign begins anew. Promises are reliably unreliable. This ambivalence of promises in the everyday of our lives made me curious and led me to question the performativity of promises in and through cities. An empirically equally fascinating and broad question, as you can imagine, even more so as the performativity of promises, regardless of the reference to cities, is being addressed conceptually by many disciplines, from philosophy over law to literature or sociology, and of course urban anthropology or anthropology. So the plan for the following 35 minutes, around 30 to 35 minutes, is first of all acknowledging the multiplicity of promises in the city, and I will do so with the help of a recent movie, Les Promesses, that will lead us a little bit through the talk. Second, studying the looseness of promises. So in the second step, and with regard to the question of transformation or social change, I would like to refer to some of the recent references that investigate the promise with regard to the city and exactly this looseness that I'm trying to translate. And I will translate this to the third step into the concept of the city as promissory assemblage, which leads to point out analytical perspectives within this concept. And finally, in the last part, I will discuss how the analytical or conceptual perspective on the performativity of promises in and of the city helps to study and perhaps transform situations of endurance, which is the opposite of social change, I guess. So endurance that results from the reliable unreliability of promises. So I guess now we would watch together this trailer. I hope it's not too loud for everybody. This trailer with English subtitles of the film Les Promesses by Thomas Kuthoff. And yeah, you can start.
Ce que vous faites, c'est de l'intimidation.
Bonjour monsieur.
C'est ça, la démocratie, franchement, répondez-moi. Est-ce que c'est ça?
Monsieur Esposito, je vous rappelle que vous n'avez rien à faire ici. Vous êtes un marchand de sommeil. Plus la cité se dégrade, et moins cher vous rachetez les appartements. Yazid, Tanguy Rkab.
Bonjour. Bonjour. On va tout rénover. Le bâti, le chauffage, l'ascenseur.
Avec un plan de rénovation sur 31 mois.
Ils ont besoin qu'on leur tende la main.
Une main à 63 millions d'euros, Clément.
La question, c'est on fait quoi, maintenant?
Il n'y a pas de plus beau mandat que celui de maire.
Vous avez peur de quoi exactement? D'assumer un peu d'ambition? Vous avez exactement le profil dont ce gouvernement a besoin.
Une chose.
Quelqu'un va vous contacter pour caler un rendez-vous.
Avec.
Le Premier ministre.
On me propose d'être ministre.
T'hésites?
Je vais me faire broyer.
Ça m'aiderait de comprendre un peu comment ça fonctionne dans ta tête.
Finalement, je te croyais différente des autres, mais t'es prête à vendre père et mère pour quelques miettes de pouvoir.
Ça fait 12 ans que je la vois se bagarrer pour les Bernardins comme si l'avenir de l'humanité en dépendait. Je te demande juste de lui faire confiance un peu.
Les plantes, ça fait 20 ans que j'en vois passer. L'État trouvera toujours une bonne raison pour ne rien faire.
Je les prends sur qui, les millions?
Mais vous faites comme vous voulez, vous vous démerdez, je m'en fous de votre cuisine.
On cherche des personnalités, pas des pirates de la politique.
Je ne suis pas là pour vous dire qu'on doit se battre, je suis là pour vous dire qu'on va gagner.
Tu vas laisser passer 63 millions sans rien faire?
T'arrêtes maintenant.
J'essaie juste de te comprendre. De ce papier dépend l'avenir d'une cité. L'avenir de plus de 3000 personnes en détresse. On abandonne, on en reste là? Moi, je suis pas d'accord.
Donc je suis honnête, mais je mens.
Une promesse non tenue, c'est pas un mensonge.
Thank you. Thank you. And perhaps for those who perhaps you could put the link in the chat. For those who on my screen it was a little bit sound and vision didn't go along regularly, so perhaps this wasn't the same for you. Anyhow, so Thomas Krutoff's, and I will come back to my slides. Yeah. So Thomas Krutoff's film Les Promesses, which premiered at the 21 Venice Biennale and opened in France in early 22, is set in a suburb of Saint-Denis, so the surroundings, northern surroundings of Paris, in the late 2010s. A committed mayoress is trying to help a large 1960s housing estate achieve much needed redevelopment via $1 million tender for urban development projects. An investment in the future of this high-rise housing estate inhabited by old residents and recent immigrants. The well-established tenants representatives witness not only the trade in illegal subletting to those who are sans-papiers, without papers and without any rights, but how they witness also how the building itself is run down. Both facts are known to the political leaders. The mayor is seriously trying to change the situation. Her chief of staff and longtime employee knows the settlement and its various actors inside out. He grew up here as a child of Algerian parents. The social rise is one of the stories narrated along the 10 socio-political geographies sketched out by the film. Through hard work, he himself has contributed significantly to the realization of the Republican promise of equal social participation for all citizens. But back to the mayor or mayoress. In order to achieve her goal of obtaining the urgently needed funds for the redevelopment, the resourceful mayor strikes a deal, as she calls it, with a person responsible in the Regional Urban Development Corporation. She owes it to her city and her employees to bring this deal to a successful conclusion during her second term in office. She has promised that she will not run for office again and has thus held out the prospect of clearing the way for the younger generation. Another promise, one that has possibly once been made in the spoken form of promise. Of course, many things turn out differently than they have been spelled out in the various promises. In a scene central to the perspective that the film casts on promises, Mayoress Clémence, visible breathes a sigh of relief when her extremely politically savvy and loyal staff member formulates the moral basis for a tactical and therefore risky promise that she is reluctant to make. She says, "So I'm honest, but I'm lying?" He says, "A broken promise is not a lie." And she smiles. The cinematic depiction of this multiplicity of more or less fulfillable promises in a political field, they're coming into play with each other, is not unrealistic. We are dealing with municipal as well as regional working contexts, and moreover with the Ministry of Urban Development. Le Grand Paris, that's the setting where the film is set. Le Grand Paris, the huge urban development project that expands Paris by more than 100 municipalities and a corresponding number of new metro stations, for instance, integrates the municipal politicians' project into the capital's transformational concerns of national appeal. The different promises connect these different levels of scale or scales from local mayor to regional urban development corporation to national urban development ministry. With regard to the political configurations, the effect of promises as scaling devices is elementary. This scaling power of the promise is, as it is staged in the film, raises conceptual questions. How exactly do promises intertwine, also outside of cinematic imagination and representation? Whom's agency is at work? And is the political field specific in this respect? In the following steps, I would like to identify research perspectives that can help answer these questions. And such perspectives are guided by approaches that are performativity oriented and So they build on speech act theory, for instance, and sensitive to socio-material assemblages. I am particularly interested in the highly ambivalent potential of promises. What is a joyful promise for one person can be a threat for another. And the joyful reference to a cluster of promises can turn into a draining attachment to an object of desire. Cultural scientist Lauren Berland, who has dealt with the representation of promises in film and literature, speaks of objects of desire that are articulating promises, or more precisely, clusters of promises. So Berland's point is, and she's my first reference since a long time, Berland's point is that a promise rarely comes alone. She also refers to the effectively charged objects of desire that emerge from clusters of promises. It is difficult for the protagonists to free themselves from the clutches of the desired objects, as they are portrayed in movies and literature that Berland has studied. In these cultural representations analyzed by Berland, these desired objects refer to social achievement, such as the labor market, educational opportunities, but also to consumer objects or more abstract ones, such as happiness. They promise participation in society in a broader sense. In addition to the captivating binding power and the devoted endurance of the characters portrayed in the attempt to possess these objects, Berland also emphasizes the emancipating self-empowering potential of endurance. And I mentioned the relation, this more positive relation between promises and endurance already at this point, because I don't want to lose sight of this ambiguous word, endurance, and it serves as a reminder to me that with a promise, provided it is taken seriously, or whenever it is taken seriously, there is a certain tension. This tension is transported, I guess, by the trailer of the movie Les Promesses in the very first place. So studying looseness of promises. How can research look like that emphasizes the potential inconsistencies of promises, their unreliability? I would like to introduce some relevant perspectives from different disciplines that have researched the ambivalence or looseness of the promise before coming in the third step to the conceptual proposition of the city as promissory summit. And I would like to mention three research dimensions that are closely interwoven when it comes to studying the looseness of promises and the city, namely the temporal, spatial, and social. Social is not really the right word, but the relational dimension of promises. So to think the relation of the city and the promise temporally can be considered a central field of interest. Promises make the future present, as speech act theory puts forward at first place, and it thus creates an amalgam of temporalities, at least present and future. And we will see a past too. Rebecca Bryant and David Knight have foregrounded in their book, The Anthropology of Future, different cultural orientations towards the future: anticipation, expectation, speculation, potentiality, hope, and destiny. Bryant and Knight claim that these future orientations are differently intensive or reliable, as you have already seen with regard to the promise that can be understood as a cultural form of this future orientations. If we take, for instance, urban development sites, as projects, they promise to realize something in the future that is nevertheless present or virtually present, or even better, present in different materialities from the very moment the project has been thought of. Might be a sketch at the beginning. The myth of the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg is the sketch that was afterwards pushing towards the development. So It may be virtually present from the moment the project has been thought of or materialized in a sketch, and from the moment people have started lobbying for it or have engaged in competition. Already we see different materialities at work, and began negotiations and finally implemented a building site, which is going to be built before it is finished as it was projected. So in my study about two cultural institutions, the Institut du Monde Arabe, the Arab World Institute in Paris, and the Institut de Culture d'Islam, the Institute of Islamic Cultures, that I have somehow restarted and started this research last autumn. I'm trying to reconstruct, for instance, these future-oriented moments of the creation of these institutions and the way they were expressed through promises. Promises that are in these cases related to cultural recognition on very different scales. In these more infrastructural projects, the future is realized in a sort of ongoing future that somehow is at the same time finished already. A future perfect, as Keith Hetherington puts it in 2016. It's Keith, right? I got his phone. Laura Kammer has dealt with this question in her study of this infrastructural promises on collectives arising from failed public transport in Rio de Janeiro. Promises as speech acts or promises of plans, timetables, asphalt, trails populated the gap left after the last public tramway line had been closed. And the notion of the gap that is filled up with a lot of promises is something that Simon Abrams and Peter Viscanis have pointed out in their volume on elusive promises. So the last tramway that Laura Kammer studied, that had historically been the first tramway in Latin America, and that had encapsulated in many ways the disciplining promise of modern urbanization as progress, in the shape of movement without friction, as Kammer writes, is at stake here once this tram has fallen down, or has been shut down. Kammer points out how the realization of this promise is permanently undermined, and so it was promised that the tram line after it, I missed the word of it, had an accident, and it was promised that it will be reinstalled. So Kammer points out how the realization of this promise is permanently undermined, and infrastructural realities consist of speculation, delay, postponement, instances of realization. A kind of, how she writes, minor future making that, I quote, calls into question the univocal temporalities of modern politics. Infrastructures are a well-established field, of course, of research where the ambivalent temporality, spatiality, and sociality of the socio-material assemblages has been studied with respect to promise. Niril Anand, Achil Gupta, and Hannah Appel, in a 2018 edited volume on the promise of infrastructures that Laura Kammer refers to, of course, have assembled examples of how central, vulnerable, and at the same time powerfully charged infrastructures are in their respective local contexts, charged with promises. They equally emphasize the above-mentioned specific temporal dimension articulated by promises, namely infrastructural promises, namely the fact that promises make the future present. That is, they make the future at least discursively tangible in the present. Furthermore, I found another idea in the volume extremely important. Infrastructures, as far as they are larger built projects, are designed for a long-term period of time, longer than one generation, for example. This holds true for cities, of course. This additional tempo, and we were talking about hotels, for instance, that get refurbished again and again, if we're lucky, and represent such an infrastructure. This additional temporal dimension of built infrastructures or once founded institutions, like in my case, seems interesting to me because it provokes new promises again and again. The once built large housing estate has to be redeveloped, which in turn can become an election campaign promise. Or the cultural institution, as in my case, gets a new directorate, which formulates new promises when it takes office, or has already done so in the application process, and now reformulates this to a larger public. Besides time and space, the relational dimension of promises is clearly ambivalent, if not to say tense. Laura Kemmer, Annika Kühn, and Vanessa Weber have found a wonderful notion that designates the state of expectation for a promise to be fulfilled or an infrastructure to be realized. They call this state standby. Kemmer, Kühn, and Weber, and those who have contributed to the special issue of Ephemera in 2020, have studied different modes of loose connections and urban collectivities that are sometimes on standby. Together, they developed an understanding of standby as a mode of active inactivity that goes beyond the mere technological understanding of being on hold. Contributions to the ephemera issue mentioned discuss standby as a, I quote, social ordering, synchronizing and regulating, where people, things, biological agents and technical devices are held together in a state of constant readiness. This is what Annika Kühn states in an interview with Lisa Bereitzer. And they're really very helpful differentiations of standby as this mode of being ready for. Finally, Laura Kemmer refers to the specific kind of purported indifference, vermeintliche Gleichgültigkeit in German, don't know it, check, that describes the attachment, the kind of switch off that does not cut connection. So against this background, and I will shortly give you the chance to capture the names of those that I have quoted or referred to. So against this background that is not that is probably very familiar to you, a background of real virtual future spaces and social relations provoked by promises, it seems to me useful to propose assemblage research as a framework to study urban promises. The notion of the city as promissory assemblage stems from, of course, assemblage thinking. Assemblage thinking or research is devoted to the socio-material quality of the social and is investigating human, non-human relations. There are many references for this. I myself came to it through my involvement with or interest in AMT and urban anthropology, where the anthology by Ignacio Farias and Thomas Bender, published in 2010, Urban Assemblages, has been of great influence in bringing these two areas together. Urban assemblage research is sensitive to the complexity, uncontrollability, randomness of social assemblages that are cities. In urban assemblage research, the quality of connections represents one research interest. The practices involved to stabilize connections is another, and somehow the starting point is always to, I really like the English words now, the starting point is to think of a collective as something unstable, an assemblage as something unstable. So our research interest is directed, how is it stabilized? By which social practices or others. So while the notion of urban assemblages directs our attention to the emerging, multiple and virtual modes of existence of the city, as Ignacio Farias has put it, to conceive of the city as promissory assemblage helps to qualify a specific modality and a quality of attachments within and to these assemblages. So before that background, in addition to the many cultural analytic possibilities that the figure of the promise entails, I have distilled the following forms of the effect of promises as concrete research perspectives. They all build on the very basic fact of the promise as a performative act, speech act, or other, and correspond with assemblage thinking. I distinguish the organizing, the binding or relating, and the narrative force or power. I'm not really sure it's a force or power of promises. So the organizing, what did I write here? Force, right? Force. The organizing force of promises. Here I refer to Bruno Latour, to others, of course, and he who also refers to speech act theory when he points out the ordering or organizing effect of the promise that I find ethnographically important. Latour emphasizes that a promise marks a before and after. And there I said before that the past is part of the promise too. Once a promise is uttered, you have a before the promise and an after the promise. Institutions as organizations experience moments of reorganization, directors, appointments, openings, new publications, annual reports that hold out the prospect of something new and are not infrequently associated with promises. This organizing force also rearranges things, or could be appropriated as a moment of reorganization, rearranging. It has a spatially organizing effect in the form of a here and there too. A promise here can be a threat there. The second would be the binding or relational force. The binding relational force of promises probably results in the common view of reliability at the first sight of promises. Analytically, however, exactly the opposite is possible with a promise. To claim the opposite is possible, namely, to point to the binding force in the form of non-bindingness, non-reliability. That is, to pursue a research perspective that illuminates the ambivalence of promises and that they are reliably unreliable. How is this, and the inconsistency in them? And we could ask, how is this inconsistency dealt with in everyday life? To be observed then are certainly social relations that are at the same time obliging and unobliging, that produce stable and unstable relations at the same time, or in the same, in the same context of, in the same social context, perhaps, between promising person and person receiving the promise, or between promising object and a person promising himself something from it. Here we learn about persistence and its potential. Whom does the promise connect and how? Who is the connection? How is the connection pursued? Is the promise once made important all the time? Is it also forgotten in everyday life? When and how does it reappear? How do we assess the unequal relation between promiser and promisee? Third, the narrative power of promises emerges from the incision before and after, and precisely that dazzling, binding non-commitment of promises. The narrative power fuels and transports the affective dimensions, the joyful expectation, the bitter disappointment, the unconditional trust and hope. Narratives of unfulfilled promises are, in my observation, much more frequent than those of fulfilled ones. The proposal based on this conceptual framework is to think, or rather to study, the city as a promising assemblage or a promissory assemblage. It opens up the possibility, so the hope on my side, to think together the organizing processes through promises, the looseness of urban social relations and the non-binding power, as well as the narrativization of promises as urban promises. Assemblage research allows us to trace the quality and, for example, the stabilizing practices of these expectant arrangements and connections. That is, to make tangible the complexity of these powerful vectors that promises are. I come to my last step. Enduring promises or acting for potential social change. I put in the background here, and I hope you can see it, one of the many depictions of handshakes that appear in the film. Handshakes that are actually different than promises, or they may accompany promises, I guess. It would be interesting to think about it, at least it's interesting to observe this in ethnographic research. So the empirical present value of future in promises has, I think, I hope, become clear. To be able to promise a specific future is a remedy to manage unpredictability. It's a powerful gesture with effects and perhaps more side effects. For intentions are not immediately realizable. They tend to be inconsistent in everyday life and produce inconsistency. It is precisely this tension of a reliable, unreliable social relation that can be of analytical interest. Therein lies analytical empirical potential, in my view. And with a sensitivity to this potential, we can also encounter the tension manifested in endurance. From Camus' analysis, we can learn that endurance as a mode of attachment is not so much a way of bearing, to wait, for instance, for the fulfillment of unfulfilled infrastructural promises. Instead, she observes acts of endurance that are made possible through strategic detachment from promises. So she really stresses the emancipatory aspect of enduring promises. A little bit like Lorne Burnett. But to come back to our movie, and I'm more on this side, and that's why I'm putting this movie so much forward. The movie Les Promesses, enduring is not really emancipatory in my view. There are many indications of endurance. Over the course of almost 100 minutes, we experience how the various protagonists endure different things. Some are waiting for a promise to be fulfilled with regard to the idea of social housing, housing constructions of the 60s, 70s that had promised a better life, that in the earlier slum-like settlements in the banlieue. A promise that had been fulfilled for a while and had made possible to experience affordable housing and stable infrastructures. In the course of time, these experiences were called into question again, not only materially, but also socially. So while some people moved away, others regularly protest, and most inhabitants endure. In the movie, the Tenants Association, however, does not want to wait any longer. Its representatives set a deadline, refuse to go into the conditions for the renewed promise, until the trusted person, with a lot of commitment, asks them for patience and participation for the last time. The basis, a renewed broken promise, which is not a lie. On the other hand, there is the mayor, who is also entangled in various interdependent promises or agreements which she misunderstands as promises, the handshakes, the deals. Misinterpreting one as the other, she's involved in a complicated web of more or less morally underpinned agreements, all of which would not be legally traceable. A constant management of inconsistency of her intention. A disappointed expectation on her part leads her to break a weighty promise she made. Having promised her closest colleagues not to run again and to leave the candidacy for her succession to the well-established new generation, she decides against it due to the disappointment of a promise not kept to her, and runs again. Emotions run high on all sides. She's reminded of her promise, previously held in high esteem by all. Nobody can change her mind. She's defiant about the supposed binding nature of the promise. The ambitious young politicians could wait a little longer, learn a little longer, endure a little longer before they get their chance. The mayor's renewed candidacy becomes an object of desire that activates everybody around her. She throws herself into the election campaign, which, from the point of view of others, makes her not only unworthy of respect, but above all, unapproachable, inscrutable, alien. In short, we gain insight into a structure in which follow-through is expected of pledges by their counterparts, while they themselves not always intentionally cannot keep their promises and are plagued by remorse. Clémence, the name of the mayor, made this decision to break her promise without having consulted. And this is, I think, a major insight into how promise breaking, for instance, works. One of the few individual decisions she takes in the movie. It has been emphasized by scholars that promises are remedies when they are based on witness. This is Arendt who writes this. Witness have a communal basis. This is lost here. The film also knows this, as the poster that I will show you as the last slide shows. That's where I am. The main characters who are on their way to make the promise that cannot be kept are observant, watchful. In doing so, they are observed by an undifferentiated crowd of people that we have seen before and see in the poster. More importantly, however, they are consulting with each other, for each other. The promise is not only under observation insofar as people remember it, the path to the promise in the political is a shared one. Pledger does not walk this path alone, even if it is one person who will utter the pledge and be held responsible for it. So this seems important to me because we can also speak here of distributed agency, in the sense of assemblage research, and we could think about promising and keeping promises. If you want to think positively and keep on giving promises, then we should think about them as a collaborative process more than an individual one. So if we wanted to elaborate the potential of reliably unreliable relations in this talk, if I wanted to elaborate on it, this was meant first of all as an invitation to analytically grasp them, taking the conceptual dimension of promises serious and not only thinking them as empirical, interesting stuff. This has, on the one hand, the potential to understand the quality of social relation that is shaped by future-oriented expectations, that is inscribed in spatial materialities or spatializing materialities like infrastructures, and that is fundamentally unstable. On the other hand, by referring to the potential or power of promises, I am pointing to the performative impact as social material assemblages that order, relate, and lend themselves to be narrated, as in this movie. The city as promissory assemblage points finally to the fact that endurance is a condition for the city. I am not a believer in endurance, even though they may be experienced as empowering as for in the camel state. Detachment from promises can count, in my eyes, as another way to counter endurance. Finally, collectivizing promises would, in my eyes, also lead to greater caution in making promises. It could lead to fewer situations of holding out, of enduring. It would also contribute to questioning the unequal relation between one promiser and many promising. What shape, and I come to an end, the city would then take, how it would shape our lives, is of course a matter of future investigation. I share shortly this last slide with some more references, not all of them I have taken up in this talk, but perhaps I want to read them.